Welcome back to the next edition of Specialized Radiographic Techniques. As we saw earlier, we've covered computer tomography and we discussed how sound can be used to create images. Sound and the potential of sound to detect objects has always fascinated man. So we've been observing the bats and the dolphins and have wondered how they navigate themselves with the use of ultrasound, how they communicate with each other with the use of ultrasound, and how they are able to understand objects on their way and detect fish, conduct their hunting, or hunt down their prey based on the kind of signals they get back. And this, in turn, led to the discussion or discovery of how we could use these sonar waves when you run a submarine, which was used in the First World War. Although we've known this for quite some time, it took almost 50 years for medicine to use the technology of ultrasound. And first it was used in obstetrics, and then subsequently in ophthalmology and a lot of other branches before it trickled down to oral medicine and radiology. One thing amazing about ultrasonography is that we are conventionally used to a X-ray machine or X-ray cone focal where it generates X-ray, and we have a film which records it. But for the first time in ultrasound, we find that the generation of the ultrasound and the recording of the signals are both done by the same transducer probe. So this is one thing which is very unique about ultrasonography. The next quick fact that we would like to tell you is that ultrasonographic waves are studying reflected waves, not transmitted waves. So typically in a radiograph or in a CT scan or in a tomogram, you have X-rays which pass through and through, and whatever X-rays manage to reach the film, they produce certain dark areas and the other areas are white and so on and so forth. Here, whatever is reflected is what is recorded. So these are two unique features about ultrasonography, which completely turns on its head the way we understand radiology so far. Third is ultrasonography images are real time. You are actually doing it and recording it by the recording by the operator then and there. Unlike many of the radiographs that even a technician can take, ultrasonography is usually done by the radiologist himself, and it takes a little expertise for him to decide how to use the probe and how to interpret these images as they come up on screen. You also can see, as I shall say in the next radiograph, that it's pretty difficult for you to make out the anatomical basis of these images. So you need some special training because ultrasonic images, as I say, do not conform to the anatomic visualization that we are used to. We see structures in a very macroscopic way, and here you're looking at layers of skin and connective tissue and bone. So it's a very different kind of layout that you're trying to see, and in that sense, ultrasonography is a very different imaging modality. Also, ultrasonography is one imaging modality which changed radiography from the terminology of radiography, because here we are not using radiation energy at all, which comes as a basic definition of radiology, but creating some form of energy to create an image. In that sense, again, it was a paradigm shift. So we've seen two or three paradigm shifts. We've seen paradigm shift one, that the reflected images are seen. We saw that the transducers are both the generator of the sound as well as the recorder of the sound, reflected sound. And third is that it does not look like anatomic images as such. Then in ultrasonography, bone cannot be studied. It's essentially imaging technology which is used to study soft tissue. For instance, if you see over here, this is the bone of the fetus, and the nasal bone sends a very strong signal. In fact, beyond that signal, you can't hear anything, you can't see anything, you can't record any signal. So bone tends to obscure anything which lies below it, and to that extent, it becomes difficult for you to study what lies. Bone is difficult to study, and what lies beyond bone is difficult to study. So abdomen becomes a very easy place to study. The ophthalmology, the eyeball, is very nice to study with ultrasonography, but many of the jaw areas are difficult to study. So it becomes essentially a technology or a technique to study soft tissue. Then we need to understand what are the terminologies. We say radiolucency, radiopacity, mixed radiolucency, radiopacity. So there are certain unique terminology which comes with the imaging modality of ultrasound. And this particular technology says is anechoic. That means there is no echo, nothing comes back. It passes through and through. Or hypoechoic, a little bit is sent back, a little bit goes through and through. Or hyperechoic, a lot of echo comes back. So echo is seen as a white signal, and lack of echo is seen as a black signal. So you have cysts which can look, or empty spaces which can be anechoic. So we should be familiar with how to discuss and describe ultrasonographic image. So to take a quick roundup of some facts, intimate knowledge of anatomy and physical properties of ultrasonic waves is very important when you're trying to do ultrasonography or interpret ultrasonographic images. It's mainly seen for soft tissue because we can look at certain hard tissues. There have been some work on temporomandibular joint and certain other joints, but it is not primarily for bone and hard tissues. High frequency waves. Now, typically we use frequency waves which are in the range of more than 1 million hertz, that is 1 megahertz. But for the oral tissues, we would prefer 15 or 20 megahertz because typically high frequency waves do not manage to go too deep. High frequency waves have very small wavelength, and that small wavelength is not able to jump into the tissue. It's obstructed at the superficial area. But the small wavelength also helps us to delineate finer details. So when you want to study finer details, or when you want to study superficial structures, the higher the megahertz, that is, when it gets closer to 20 megahertz, 15 megahertz, the clarity of the image is better, and studying superficial images is easier. So essentially for oral cavity, high megahertz is used, unlike for abdominal area where 3 to 5 megahertz is usually the standard of care. Likewise, we need to understand the concept of Doppler. Now, see this video which helps you to understand the idea of Doppler.
Understand the universe.
If you heard it right, you would hear it making something like so there's a rise in the pitch, and this pitch sharply falls. So it has been found that sound waves, when it travels towards you, it tends to increase the pitch, and when it travels away from you, it decreases the pitch. And based on this, you can find out the way the blood is flowing, whether it's flowing towards you or whether it's flowing away from you. So this kind of Doppler effect or color Doppler changed the way we could image and use ultrasound to understand what we are studying even better. Then we also have this concept of ultrasound guided aspiration or cytology. Now, if you want to take a small sample, either a biopsy or a aspirate from a particular tissue, now you can see that you can actually insert and reach the tissue that you wish to and get your aspirate from the tissue that you wish. So you can see that there are 3 cavities here. This is the least, this is hypoechoic, and these 2 are anechoic, and you want your needle to reach. So this is the needle goes down here and is right over here and is able to aspirate what you want. So ultrasound guided aspiration becomes very safe because you don't need to use any form of radiant energy. So there's no ionizing radiation used, and yet you get a very precise localization from which you can get a representative tissue. So therefore, if you were to take in a nutshell, ultrasonography is very useful when you're looking in the maxillofacial region, the salivary glands, lymph nodes, when you want to study either tuberculous lymph nodes, metastatic lymph nodes. You want to do FNAC guided by ultrasound. You want to look any of the soft tissue cysts like dermoid cyst, or when you want to identify the kind of hemangioma that you're looking at, a color Doppler could be useful. And so these ultrasound becomes very, very useful for a lot of soft tissue. Now a few basic facts about ultrasound. Human hearing ranges from 1500 to 20,000 hertz, 20 kilohertz. So from 1500 to 20,000 hertz. So when you go beyond 20,000 hertz, you enter what is known as ultrasonographic age. So when that 20,000 hertz is multiplied by another 1,000 and becomes 2 million, that becomes 2 megahertz. So 1 to 5 megahertz was initially used, and now most modern ultrasonographic machines use a wide range of ultrasonographic waves. Usually these machines have the entire range from 1 to 18, and depending on what they need, they adjust their frequency so that they can get the kind of image that they wish to understand and study. Now, how does this ultrasonographic waves get generated? Ultrasonographic waves get generated by a crystal. Now these crystals are a kind of semiconductor. They are having some charge, and therefore they are in a kind of equilibrium. When an electric current passes through them, because of the charge, these electrical charges which are already there in this metal, they rearrange themselves and therefore distort the crystal. That means the crystal changes its shape, and the moment the current stops, it goes back to its original shape. So this starts a very quick vibration, and this quick vibration generates an ultrasound. Likewise, when the ultrasound waves gets reflected and affects this crystal, it in turn vibrates and creates an electrical signal. The ultrasound, which is the crystal which is used, is lead zirconate titanate. You can remember it from the fact that in radiology we use lead, and you have zirconia crowns, and you have titanium implants. So you can remember that lead zirconate titanate helps us to create ultrasonographic waves. So that was a fascinating journey of how sound and ultrasound entered the field of radiology and converted to imagology. Now we are on the verge of yet another fascinating advanced imaging, which lets you know about the kind of disease process and whether before it's morphologically seen. That means when it is still biochemical in its location, you are able to identify it. That means you are much, much ahead of the disease because you are able to check the biochemistry and biochemical change. What is that kind of imaging that helps us to understand the biochemical change? We shall see in our next edition, which will be started soon. So radionuclide imaging is an imaging which is not so much about studying the disease process or the diagnosing the disease, but to study the activity of the disease. So if you have done a periodontal surgery in a patient of juvenile periodontitis and you would like to know whether the matter has got settled or whether the disease is still active. If you have treated a case of chronic osteomyelitis and you want to know whether it is settled or whether there is still some residual infection that is there which is causing some change, since we know that morphological change takes quite some time, even with a CT scan, even with an MRI, you may not be able to get right down to the biochemistry of the tissue. So how is it that you can get into the biochemistry of the tissue and image biochemistry? That sounds really fascinating. So let us see how this is done by something called radionuclide imaging. So for understanding radionuclide imaging, we need to understand that first and foremost that radionuclide imaging is a kind of functional imaging. You're looking at the function of certain tissues, you're utilizing the biochemical processes of certain tissues and capturing them in an image. How do we do this? Now we know that all elements have isotopes. Isotopes are those of elements are those which have almost the same chemical properties or the same chemical properties, because chemical properties are based on the number of electrons, but their physical properties are slightly different because their atomic number is slightly different. as not atomic number, their atomic weight is slightly different. So they have a different number of neutrons, and some of these isotopes are unstable, and therefore they become radioactive isotopes. So when you understand a radioactive isotope is in a position to emit gamma rays. Otherwise, it behaves exactly like a carbon atom or an iodine atom. So biochemically, it's going to behave very similar. But you are going to be able to image the movement of these molecules along the body. And this helps you to understand the disease process involved. So in this radionuclide imaging, one interesting aspect is that you now inject the radionuclide into the patient. And this radionuclide gets distributed all over the body, but it gets concentrated in those areas which need that particular element. So typically in bone, it would be calcium, but instead of calcium, we use something called technetium, which is very similar in its behavior. Likewise, in thyroid, you would use iodine. So you use a particular element which that particular organ requires and will use in greater quantity if it is active at that particular location. Now, which also means, very interestingly, that the source of the energy lies within the patient. So you have, so it's not you have an X-ray. First, we saw where the X-ray machine is outside and the receptor is outside, and they are two different entities. In ultrasound, we found that the generation of the energy and the receptor of the energy was one and the same. That was a different. That was something different and unique. And now we have a situation where the production of the radiation signal is from within the body and the receptors are outside. So the patient is actually radiating energy, and you have to isolate him for 6 to 8 hours so that he does not give a dose of radiation which is not called for to unsuspecting relatives or the public at large. Now, radionuclide imaging, as I told you in the beginning, is to study the activity, not so much to diagnose the disease. So we use some flat panel detectors in this, and certain common radionuclide elements have been identified here, and we've covered this part already. So you use either a rectilinear scanner, or nowadays what we use is a gamma camera. Gamma cameras have multiple scanning units, just like we saw multiple arrays in computed tomography. And there's a scintillation crystal which reduces or makes it more sensitive to gamma radiation. And you can see you have in this you use something called hot spots or cold spots. So this is the terminology that you use in radionuclide imaging. So here you see there's a cold spot. So cold spot would include an area. So in this place, this thyroid is not produced. This thyroid scan is showing one area of cold spot, which means that there is a growth there, but this particular area of thyroid is not functioning. So it could be a malignant nodule, or it's at least not an actively functioning nodule. So you could have a hot spot, a hot nodule, which is a little darker. That means this is going to be sort of resulting in hyperthyroidism because it is actively taking iodine, it's actively working and producing thyroid. So without going into too much of complicated testing, you're in a position to understand the activity of the disease. So you're not now only looking at it as a thyroid nodule, you're looking at it as a thyroid nodule which is either producing thyroxine or not producing thyroxine, and this becomes invaluable when you're treating disease. Likewise, there is something called single photon emission computed tomography. In this, you have the technology, or you attach it to a computer which which collects information coming from it, and you get an image like this. So you have hot spots and cold spots generated, where an entire slice of image is reconstructed by the computer. So this doesn't have to be a single photon one. It could be similarly a multi gamma camera with an array of detectors. But the key here is that it's able to create slices of the image instead of what we saw earlier, where you only had uh, an image. So likewise, you have something called positron emission tomography. Now we have to understand what is a positron. A positron is a positive electron. A positron, very difficult for it to remain unattached. So the moment a positron is generated, within a fraction of a millisecond, it immediately is consumed by an electron, and there is something called an annihilation. Annihilation means tabahi. It doesn't exist. It is destroyed completely. So something called an annihilation reaction or radiation. This annihilation radiation or reaction is where energy comes out of the annihilation, because now there is no electron, there is no positron. So this energy, this mass has been converted into energy. And interestingly, they are given out in perpendicular at 180 degrees to each other. Because they are given at two right angled photons, it is like x and y coordinates. And this helps us to locate the location of annihilation, which is in effect where this particular positron containing chemical has reached. And the computer then reconstructs based on this information. So this is known as positron emission tomography. This positron emission tomography can be combined with computer tomography and can give rise to what is known as PET-CT, or positron emission tomography computer tomography. This gives greater clarity. So one of the most common reasons why we do PET-CT is to identify early metastasis. And one of the common molecules we use is fluorine, which is tagged with deoxyglucose. Now, glucose is used very, very actively by the rapidly multiplying malignant cells. And this is detected by PET-CT and helps us to identify an early metastasis. Radionuclide imaging comes at a very, very high dose. So its dose reaches up to 2000 microsieverts, and it can go up to 14,000 microsieverts. PET-CT can go up to 14,000 microsieverts. Now, if you compare it to external radiography, which is in the range of 500,000, or CT scan, which is a similar, goes up to 2000 microsieverts, or IOPA, which is about 2 or 3 microsieverts, you find that this is a phenomenally very, very high dose. So there must be very strong reasons for you to undertake this kind of imaging. But it helps us to identify certain diseases which are not picked up or understood or quantified very well by other methods. So typically chronic osteomyelitis, early metastasis, thyroid function, salivary gland functions. Wharton's tumor is a particular tumor of the salivary gland which actively produces saliva, and it's diagnostic. If you have Wharton's tumor or suspect Wharton's tumor in your differential diagnosis, then CT scan becomes a very important, or radionuclide imaging becomes a very important part of your imaging process. Similarly, fibrous dysplasia. When you want to operate on a fibrous dysplasia and you want to know whether it's been quiescent, whether now you can go ahead, it's not like we know fibrous dysplasia is a hamartoma and it may continue to grow. Similarly, if you want to find out whether it's a condylar hyperplasia of one side or hypoplasia of the other side, or whether it's a tumor, so you need to identify the kind of processes that are going on. In such cases, it is very useful for you to do radionuclide imaging. A quick fact, radioactive B12 is also used in something called Schilling's test. It is not a part of radionuclide imaging, but you use the same concept of radionuclide tagging of a particular chemical like vitamin B12 and see the process it goes through and helps us to identify a disease called pernicious anemia. So radionuclides are again a fantastic idea of imaging, and it really calls for the ingenuity of man to utilize various naturally occurring radioisotopes, creating new isotopes, and managing to understand the disease process and become better at identifying biochemical process of disease and identifying disease before it manifests in the morphological term. In our next edition, we shall be looking into a very complicated process called MRI. So in MRI, we use again something which occurs in nature, that is the magnetic field. But how does the magnetic field that we hardly ever perceive on Earth be used? And do we in our body carry any magnets that we can use and image? we shall see in our next edition. Thank you for being with me. It has been really a pleasure sharing my journey of discovering various specialized radiographic techniques and sharing them with you. Thank you.